Okay, so this one is sort of a continuation of what I was talking about in the Site 27 campaign diaries, but kind of, encounter design and homebrewing some monsters kind of like on the fly. Say, you've got a session coming up, and you've got like the big beats planned. They're going through this dungeon, and there's a thing at the end, and like maybe you need some puzzles, maybe not, who knows. But you're like, oh shit, I don't have any monsters. You could always just grab monsters out of the monster manual or whatever. There's tons of monsters you can just go grab. But if you want to make one for some reason, like say like nothing, like you look through the books and you look through some stuff, some stat blocks, and nothing's hitting the way you want. Nothing's just right for the experience you're trying to craft here. So in that situation, because this was my situation on Friday or Saturday, last time I DM'd, essentially I had like some rough layouts for the monsters, just like they're going to be these horror thing raccoons, and then come up with stats as I use them. But I came up with the idea of what the monster's going to do, like a general layout, but I didn't have any numbers and I didn't have any mechanics written out. And instead I came up with the mechanics on the fly. So let's say, and I'm going to use the Erlenmeyer party as an example. You want a much more, like a bigger combat than just, you're fighting some raccoons. Instead, let's say this is like, the party is being hunted by this hired knight who's known, as a specialty hunter that tracks down dangerous threats, whatever. And this guy's main gimmick is that he has like an impenetrable suit of armor, and he can summon any weapon he wants at will. Something like that. This guy's, he's primo. So, you could go the simple route and just have him, summon a bunch of different weapons. He can summon or create a weapon for whatever the situation is. Like, if everybody starts fighting him from range, then he can start throwing weapons or summoning great bows and stuff and doing that. Or if he's fighting multiple targets, he can summon multiple different weapons and cut off lines of attack by like planting shields or something. But maybe you want a more like directly interactive and more narrative experience. So let's say this particular knight, his armor is also enchanted. Like, one, it's impervious, and we'll get into a mechanic for that in a minute. But it's impervious, so the players have to figure out a way to deal damage. If your players don't have access to magic weapons yet, you could always make that how it's impervious, but that's not the case for the Erlenmeyer party. You always have to take into consideration your party's capabilities. Like, if they're constantly using a hold person spell, like that's their favorite spell, you got to consider that. You can't just throw a monster at them because they're just going to paralyze it and win. Well, there's lots of ways around that. So, let's say, for the sake of argument, or lay out what our characters can do. We've got our Wild Magic Barbarian, who's big and strong and big. They've also got some latent magical craziness because wild magic. So that's a thing. We've got Henich, our my Lizard Folk Ranger. Close range burst damage, some utility spells, can fight at mid-range if he needs to, using darts. So darts probably wouldn't be very effective, and his darts aren't magical, so that's one of Henich's options cut out right there. We've got Zika, the rogue, usually plays by via carefully aimed shots with their heavy crossbow and or their psychic blades instead if they need to mix it up. And Ayla, sorcerer, can can and will get into close range if she's feeling spicy, but usually won't. Relatively offensive party. Now, how do you separate this and give each character unique stuff to do in this more narrative fight? Like, you have fights that it's just a fight and it's all like, quote, by the numbers, and you're just watching numbers go down. And if that can be difficult and you just have to employ tactics, that's fine. But maybe you want a more narrative experience here. So, designing this like random knight, he's got this big impervious suit of armor and he can summon weapons. And on top of that, he has some arcane wards of some kind that you have to get through so that he can defend himself from weapons, magic, everything. And let's say his suit of armor has a set of Magitech arms coming out of the back of his armor. Like, where wings would be on an angel, he's got a set of arms that can wield more weapons. And let's say he's got, or depending on how the fight starts, let's say Henich and Zephyria rush in and start to attack him. Maybe they get in 1 or 2 licks. And also, his armor is impervious in some way, so they can't actually hit him for whatever reason. So, let's say he's got, this guy also has, he's just holding 2 morning stars, like just maces in his normal arms, and his magic arms are holding 2 giant-ass shields that he brings down to protect himself even further. Now, theoretically, why wouldn't the party run away? Don't worry about that. Maybe he's trapped them in a dome spell that they can't escape. Yeah, sure, that makes sense. Some bullshit. Who cares? But, so, the 2 melee players can't hurt him because his armor is incredibly difficult to get through, and he has these giant-ass shields that he just gives himself essentially total cover with. So they have to rotate around to his back. They have to try to flank him. Now he has to split the shields, and he can hold 1 in front of each character, but that leaves him open from other angles, something like that. Well, then Zika and Ayla can start attacking him from other angles. Well, is that going to work? Maybe. But all of Ayla's spells will have to get through those arcane words. And how exactly will that function? Will it just be, will it just be like a mechanical thing that he just gets advantage on saving throws versus magic, and he gets, a +5 to AC versus a spell attack rolls or something? Could be that. Or maybe he's got 3 layers of arcane wards, and these wards have their own AC and HP. Not a lot, of course. Like, they might have 10 HP or something. But they will fully absorb a single spell. Now, theoretically, you could use a really powerful magic missile spell to just rip through that. Unless you make these effectively shield spells at the same time, so it's immune to something like magic missile. But I'm sure you could find another spell that does multiple instances of damage and just rip this down. But, so you might add some defenses against that type of thing. Like, a single ward only has 10 HP, but more than 1 ward can't be taken down in a single turn or something. Yeah, like say the ward will absorb damage up to 10, then it will start to fade, but it will not, it doesn't fully fade until the end of the current turn. And as long as it hasn't completely faded, it will continue to absorb damage. Something like that. Just a quick little narrative write-up for why it doesn't, you can't just delete it with like a 3rd level magic missile. So, Ayla has to spend some turns getting through these arcane wards. unless theoretically someone else with a spell attack rolls can get through it. Or maybe these arcane words refresh on a turn, and maybe the arcane words are why this knight's armor is so impenetrable. And yeah, maybe that's why when magic weapons have such a hard time getting through it, because normal weapons can't get through it, but magic weapons are subject to these arcane words. So a single character can't really get through them, and all three of these arcane words refresh at the start of this knight's turn, something like that. And then maybe they're down. Well, now this knight retreats a little bit. He backs up and he places his shields down and fully protects himself. That could potentially give the two melee characters a way to get around it. Like, say, either Henich or Zephyria try to attack him, and you either have to make use one of your attacks. You have to use one of your attacks to make some sort of, let's just make it simple and make it a dex or a strength save to get through it. If you choose strength save, you're ripping the shields apart, and then you can get one clean attack through. And for the sake of making this not mind-numbing, this knight doesn't have a whole lot of HP. He relies entirely on his ironclad defenses. He might only have 60 or 70 HP. So landing one good attack is enough to do a third of his life. Something like that. But you have to continually get through all these arcane wards and rip his shields apart. So Zephyria would rip the shield apart and then get in one attack. Whereas Henich, one who has more attacks, that's a factor, so he might be able to do that. But maybe this is factoring in individual characters' abilities, but he's a 2-weapon fighter, so he effectively has more attacks. Not counting Polearm Master, I'm not worried about that. But he would make, say, a dex save to get around it in some way. Either by, say, faking out and juking to one side, and this knight is trying to track where Henich is, and he jukes out and then gets around and gets inside the shields and lets loose with a few attacks. Something like that. Give the characters something to interact with in a way. Now, I probably wouldn't allow something like this for ranged attacks, because you can't really, if you're 60 feet away from this dude and he's got these two giant ass shields giving himself essentially total cover, you can't fake out and get a different angle. Then another thing that I was thinking about you could throw in this case, maybe this knight's armor can kind of be softened up by acid, which is something that Ayla does. She's a draconic spirit, draconic soul sorcerer, draconic bloodline sorcerer. I keep saying draconic soul. Draconic bloodline sorcerer, black dragon ancestor, so she has acid affinity. She gets she gets some boost to acid damage. So maybe if anytime he fails a saving throw against an acid spell, or he takes acid damage in some way, his armor gets soft. Either you could temporarily or permanently lower the AC in this case, or for this particular enemy, and this might be something you extend to other heavily armored enemies in the future, but maybe the acid temporarily makes the armor itself vulnerable. So if you hit him with some acid damage, and another player, then before the start of that sorcerer or the acid damage, whatever character did the acid damage, whatever character did the acid damage, before their next turn, or before the start of their next turn, any weapon hits or just hits against him has a chance to degrade his AC permanently, for example. So that represents damaging the armor. Or maybe you're destroying the shields, something like that. Because maybe if you figure that out, then you can throw acid on the shields. Then the knight would still take some light acid damage in that case. But then Zephyria could just attack the shields and cut them in half, maybe. That could be fun. Just like simple little ideas like that. Because most of the time, you don't need to have tons of fights that are just you fighting and using normal mechanics. You want to throw in like contextual or creative stuff like this, at least like maybe for a third or even half the fights, to just like spice it up a little bit. That's kind of it I have for this. Just a quick like stream of thoughts. That's all.